Uganda is commonly purported to be a majority Christian nation with varying figures between 80 and 85%, often touted as professing some form of Christian faith. However, it may come as a surprise to you to find out that Uganda is in the top 70 most dangerous places to be a Christian, with encroaching Islamic extremism from terror groups affiliated with Islamic State, or whether from tribal opposition and various dynamics within local communities. Christians are increasingly under pressure. And yet there remains bold light and love shown by those who are following Jesus in spirit and in truth. This is the Persecuted Church. I'm Regan King, and joined by my good friend and co-host Alistair Scott to introduce you to the Persecuted Church in Uganda. How are you, Alistair?
I'm really well, and I'm really pleased with the subject we've chosen for today in Uganda, because I know you've just recently come back from Uganda, but since the mid-90s I've been working in Uganda, and I've seen the changes that we're talking about happen in that nation. We'll come to it more and more during the program, but it is a wonderful country. There's some very strong Christians. They have seen revivals, but like most places, you have a revival and then it tends to just level off a little bit. And I know in the last few years I've been going there, I've been telling the leaders that we gather together, pray for revival in your nation. And if you want to see that revival, bless the people of Israel, pray for revival in Israel too, and it seems to do the trick.
What are some of the big challenges from your assessment of the situation in Uganda in general, but then narrowing that down to the church and experience of persecution in particular?
Well, over the years, the major problems, not looking at even the Islamic influence, which we will look at today, has been lack of education, poverty, and even as churches started to grow stronger, the people were still being exploited in some ways in the wrong way. So education is something we've worked on big time since we've been there. We built them schools. We've even within Kampala we've organized for our young children who we bring out of the slum areas to be educated. It's not always the best thing to provide them with a new school, but we get them into schools and pay their fees. And you know, some of those young people who've come through from being 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes they start school very late, are now going through A-levels, and we've even had some go into universities. But that's the biggest challenge, apart from this, I've seen it, this kind of expansion of the Islamic influence. In the early days when I was there, it didn't seem that strong, but now you see it more and more in the streets of Kampala. Even on a Friday afternoon, if you go into the town where their mosque is, there are thousands of them out there gathering and praying, and they become more and more hostile in their threat to the Christian church and the Christian people. So it's really, when we're praying for nations like that, we pray that they would be more and more courageous and strong in their faith, get back to that time where the faith has been shared in the streets, and it still does, but it needs to come up a level, I believe.
I think there's some importance to discussing the origins of the gospel coming to Uganda, and it's a fascinating story. We can go back to the 1800s. Perhaps there was some form of gospel proclamation in Uganda prior to that. Perhaps there were believers going back longer, but it seems that the primary introduction to Uganda came in the mid-1800s, and it essentially arrives at a point in time in the ancient kingdom, now one of the districts of Uganda that's called Buganda, and there was the King Kabaka Mutesa in 1877. Now, Islam was already beginning to be introduced, but there were some political dynamics that this individual Mutesa and others were resentful of. They were resentful of certain cultural elements being upended, and as well as that includes butchering and some of Sharia type law stuff. So those issues were even there in the 1800s. But there was it was interesting that Uganda in its introduction to the gospel in a massive way came nearly a century after the initial wave of missionary activity from Europe across the rest of the African continent. But within a very short space of time, it had become a nation that was viewed as one of the most successful mission fields across the entire continent. So the king of this ancient kingdom of Uganda, Mutisa, was met by Henry Morton Stanley, a very famed individual, who would write a very famous letter to the Daily Telegraph, and he would describe what he was encountering in Uganda. And it's been viewed as quite a romanticized image, perhaps. He was on a little bit of an adrenaline high, thinking that this Mutisa was going to be incredibly friendly and open to the gospel. He's presented this individual as highly enlightened and eager to hear the gospel and even to help with its spread across Uganda. But perhaps, and I think that's often the problem when it comes to kind of the mission element alongside the colonial element, there was this conflation between some of the British Empire values as such with the spread of Christianity, and that would put many communities at a place where they felt deeply threatened.
Yeah, colonization is the word, isn't it? That it happens all over the world. I think it's one of our faults when we go out as missions. We try and make a nation be like us. And really, Christianity is beyond any culture or any nation or any tradition. So I'm sure the opposition, he would have felt, he had a lot of enthusiasm, but things didn't stay as well as he hoped that they would.
Well, the letter did spawn an immediate reaction, and quite a few Anglican missionaries began to assemble. They began to set up a plan to go and bring the gospel to Uganda, but tragically there were tensions that began to arise by the late 1870s, and there was also some justified paranoia that actually, hold on, this seems, there was word that some of these individuals seemed to be encouraging an invasion of British troops into Uganda, which is reprehensible. As you just said, it has nothing to do with the spread of the gospel, but unfortunately that was happening. And so some of the paranoia in regard to some of these individuals coming over as missionaries may have been justified, but there was one individual who was not really involved in that. His name was James Hannington. He was 37 years old, Anglican missionary, and he was put to death on October 29th, 1885 in a rather brutal fashion. This was swiftly followed by a massacre of many Christians, many Christian missionaries, and a large part of that, if you look at the history of it, is that these were people who were encouraging, they were taking some of the people from these communities where there were, without going into all of the crude details of it, participating in just completely immoral practices, and they were discouraging, as these are new believers now, they were saying, no, you shouldn't be partaking in that. So it was very countercultural in good ways as well. But because of that seemingly antisocial element, taking especially youth out of these situations, there was a lot of persecution. But then fast forward to the 1970s, and we have, of course, Idi Amin. You remember Idi Amin?
I do remember him well, because really when I first started working in Uganda, I started because when we were in Bible school together, I got to meet a Ugandan young man who was in the same year as us, and so I helped him afterwards. And the stories of Idi Amin then were rife. You know, he had been a despot, he had been a tyrant, he had been a dictator, and he brought in Islamic belief into the nation. He was a Muslim himself, and the good thing that happened as a result was that the Christians started to pray. And one thing about Ugandan history, or recent history, is that they are a people who pray. They're real intercessors. I remember talking to people. There was a particular area where we now have a church called Luero, a district, and that was one of his strongholds, Idi Amin. And literally people were being slaughtered, Christians were being killed, and their bodies were left in the roads. And it took several years, and around about the end of the 90s, that one of the guys who had property there, who was a Christian and had run and lived in Kampala, asked, would you support us to go back and reclaim our land and build a church and a school there? And that was one of the first things we did. But the Idi Amin regime was a frightening time. But because the people were praying so much, revival started to come. And you know, Idi Amin, we know, didn't last too long. He was removed and ended up going off to Saudi Arabia.
Between 1971 and 1976, while he was in control of things, some 400,000 Christians are estimated to have died, disappeared, or fled the country. It's believed that there was a total of up to 300,000 of all Ugandans who were massacred under Idi Amin, and others disappeared, likely they were disappeared, and or fled. There was one particular individual, Janani Luam, who was a bishop, and he was overseeing a church, and he was apparently shot by Idi Amin himself. So one of the most bloodthirsty dictators of the last century, and that had a catastrophic impact on Uganda as a whole. But as if I'm picking up from you correctly, it was really in and through that season that those followers of Jesus Christ really began to pray, and God was working and bringing hope in that hurt.
Exactly. I mean, it's one of those, I heard so many stories with people I meet of churches or people groups who were Christians who would fled and living in the woods and the forest, because there's a lot of forested areas, you've probably found out, and they would just gather together and pray and pray and pray to God. And you know, it was the whole emphasis of the gospel is to keep your eyes fixed on the Lord, and they were crying out to the Lord for deliverance, and he answered, you know, and it was a horrendous time. As you see, the figures of those who died are probably more than we're quoting, because there'd be many who just disappeared and never came back. A lot did leave the country and then moved back once the Idi Amin regime came to an end. But I really believe with all my heart that the power of prayer, they became... I remember speaking to my friend, the pastor who is now one of our leaders there, when he was in Bible school, and he said, if you didn't have faith in God, you would die. And that's the truth. Either you have faith in him as being your healer, or faith for him being your protector, your shepherd. And they would pray these words and declare these words with total faith. Yeah. And God protected the Christianity which was dying really under Idi Amin, and brought it back up. And as you say, the figures we see now is it's supposedly something like 80% or 84% of the nation proclaimed to be Christians. They're not as strong as they were once, because as I said earlier, what tends to happen is you get comfortable in your Christianity and you lose the sharp edge of...
And you know, of course we want to always recognize that the figures and the statistics that are there are across all boundaries, and so the believed statistic of those who are truly born again evangelical believers is much less than that, but the identification is still quite significant. And today, fast forward to what Uganda is experiencing today, there remains a lot of struggle. There remains an immense amount of poverty. There is very poor infrastructure in some parts, and there are very real concerns with governance, and there's a lot that could be said in that regard. But at the same time, there's this massive threat of Islamic extremism once again, particularly from groups like ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, which presents itself as a national army for liberation of Uganda, and it's actually affiliated with the Islamic State. And it was only last year that this group, which often camps out very close to where I was visiting recently, but often also just across the Congolese border. They infiltrate and seeks to spark up insurgencies. Last year, though, they went into a school at night. It was a boarding school, and they massacred so many students. CBN reports on that horrific event.
It's a story that is difficult to report because it's about children in Uganda. At 10 p.m. on June 16th, Christian students at the Mpandwe Secondary Boarding School prepared for bedtime. One neighbor said she heard the children singing a gospel song before sleep. But suddenly murderous mayhem erupted as they were attacked in their beds by machete-wielding rebels, members of the Allied Democratic Forces. But the ADF is anything but democratic. They are brutal and evil Islamic State-affiliated terrorists. Witnesses overheard them shout Allahu Akbar as they proceeded to slaughter 41 people, including 37 children. 6 children were kidnapped. Male students were locked inside their dormitory and burned alive as the building was set afire. Mpandwe is a Ugandan border town beside the Democratic Republic of Congo. Based in the DRC's North Kivu province, the ADF crossed over the border and launched their planned attack against that Ugandan school. Folks, a year and a half ago, after a bombing in Kampala, the machine gun preacher, missionary Sam Childers, warned us that the ADF would spread more terror throughout the region.
They just want to try to take over the country. I believe that they want to put a threat there so maybe they can get some leeway. They're almost cowardless, thoughtless, loveless people. All they want to do is kill, and it reminds me of Joseph Kony.
As he did in response to Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, President Museveni has pledged to send Uganda's UDF troops to the border region to defeat the ADF. I interviewed Museveni and many of the LRA victims years ago in Uganda, and it took 20 years to defeat Kony and the LRA. Uganda will need help if the country is to be successful this time. Donald Trump, American troops, and allies defeated the Islamic Caliphate in Syria. But ISIS splinter groups are now operating worldwide, especially in Africa. If the United States can help Ukrainians in their struggle against Russia, why not help our African ally, Uganda? We must do what we can to prevent more innocent Ugandan children from being slaughtered in their beds at night in the name of Allah.
Well, I have the privilege of knowing Pedson Kasume, who's the director of Bwera Charity Project in Uganda, and also he is a pastor and church leader across a network of churches, the UCC network that is there, particularly overseeing churches in Western Uganda. Pedson, thank you so much for joining our program today.
It is my pleasure to be part of this program, Pastor Regan.
Tell me a little bit and share with our viewers about some of the work that you are doing, particularly in the context of hostility faced by some Christians. I know that there are people who have left Islam who are in your church and they've experienced some real trials. Share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we began Bwera Charity Project Uganda to basically support all members of the community, including, of course, all other people from other religions, although we are Christians. And we have had challenges with the hostility, in particular to some of our church members and charity members, especially those who are Muslims. We, for example, have got a young man who when we started supporting him, took him to a driving school and got him a driving permit. And when his family discovered that he was part of us and we were supporting him, they decided to grab his property because his father had died a number of years back, and the property had been left under the care of his uncles and other relatives. So they decided to grab the land and erected a mosque there. Up to now, he's not able to access his land, his property, because there is a mosque that is running in that place. So that's just one example of the young people we've been working with.
Thank you for sharing that, Pedson. There's also just 1 kilometer or so away from one of the church plants that you have overseen and pastored, a school site where we heard just last year there was a massive massacre. How common is this, and what is the threat that the militant terror group, the ADF, poses to Christians in that region?
Yeah, I think it was very so deadly. That happened last year, most especially when the ADF attacked one of our schools. In fact, just 1 kilometer from my house. And one sad news that is reported is that these guys used to ask the young people their names to identify whether they actually have got Christian names or have got Muslim names. So if any of them mentioned a Muslim name, they would be excused from death. They would be spared. Unfortunately, over 40 of them were all having Christian names, and so that's why they lost it and were all slaughtered. That's one of the news that came out of that story last year. So deadly.
Okay, thank you for sharing that experience. And from your perspective, what would you like viewers to know in regard to the persecution of believers in Uganda, and how can viewers of the Persecuted Church be praying for you and your ministry?
The main cause of this hostility and persecution, I believe, is caused by the increase, the expansion of the church. Across the entire country, Jesus Christ is being preached in every corner of our country. And so that is what is increasing the hostility, because the number of Catholics is reduced, the number of Anglican believers are reduced, as well as those of the Muslim community. So we would like the world to pray for us so that the increase will continue, but at the same time, God should be able to change the hearts of these people, that they may be saved, so that the persecution will perhaps reduce.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Pedson, and God bless you in your important ministry and work. I'm sure we'll hear from you again sometime.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pastor Regan, and may God bless you all.
It's a really good interview there with Pedson. Very encouraging, isn't it, to hear of people like that ministry who are determined to take the gospel out no matter what the restrictions may be or whatever the persecution that comes against them. They are continuing to walk the walk, talk the talk, share the gospel of Jesus Christ, and people are getting saved. So it's very good to hear your wonderful interview there and everything you've told us today. We are so encouraged to hear what you are doing in Uganda.
There's so much hope, isn't there? There's immense hurt, there's immense catastrophe, there's a lot of concern that's there. But what I really valued from my observation of Where a Charity Project and the work of various UCC churches, and there's other churches as well that are out there doing very similar good work. You've shared a little bit about the work that you've been involved in, but they're going into dark places. They're going into the ghettos in the cities. They're taking youth who have nothing. They have no faith. And so what you said earlier, if you have no faith, you die. They're dying. And there's nothing to live for. The system is fixed so that there is very little ability for social elevation. And We're a Charity Project and others, that they're going out and they're taking these kids from the ghettos, they're putting them in safe homes, they're rehabilitating them, they're getting them off the jet fuel, which they inhale in mass, and the other drugs that they take. They're getting the girls out of human trafficking and prostitution, domestic slavery, and they're giving them hope centered on Jesus Christ. And so they're seeing lives changed. And as he's said, I met one of these individuals, Ibrahim, who left everything. He was willing to follow Jesus. And it's a really wonderful and powerful lesson to us here today.
It's funny enough, we work we've started in Kampala, or on the outskirts of Kampala, where the slums are, we called it the Hope Center for that simple reason, because they were going in and offering hope. But you know, one of the things as we should be doing as believers, even at a distance away, just remember when you look at the map of Uganda, they're surrounded, aren't they? They're surrounded by Islamic nations. You know, there's the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a major terrorist type of area. You've got Sudan. One side you've got Kenya, which is a useful, because they're quite strong in the Christianity, but most of the surrounding nations around them are very strongly influenced by Islam, and they do come in, and there's like an east-west divide in Uganda particularly, because there's a poverty area, and I've noticed when I've been out in the villages around Uganda, how many of these places have suddenly got a mosque in the middle of it, you know.
It's one of their priorities. I was told, we were in random places, and there would suddenly, out of nowhere, be a mosque. And I was told that this has been going on for the past couple of centuries. Whenever Arab traders came into Uganda, every town, every village they went into, whether they stayed there or not, they would erect a mosque. And you see it all across Uganda.
It's their way of claiming the territory.
Yes.
And I mean, I think we forget that in our nation as well. This tends to happen, that once they've placed their mosque, they start to have an influence. And then they also get financially
Well-funded.
Aided by, you know, the Emirates and all these other places. So they're able to go in with bribes, really, to entice people who have been following Christian faith.
And I think it's a good call and point of action that we have a responsibility to help support our brothers and sisters. You know, the Muslim community is enriched, and it's helped, and it's aided, and it's elevating because of its support from wealthier Islamic nations. Those of us who are in places to be able to support in some way, you would be shocked, our viewers would be shocked to know how much. I mean, we have people out there on £80 salaries a month. That's what we're dealing with. So you can sponsor children for as little as £35 to £50 a month. And so, you know, we have that responsibility to show love to our suffering brothers and sisters there in Uganda.
And as you say, a little money goes a long, long way. I can remember one of the times I was there, I came back home and we stopped off and had a McDonald's, and then we paid something like £15, £20. And I immediately was thinking that money could keep a family in food for a whole month. So important for us just be motivated to pray for our brothers and sisters in Uganda, that the Holy Spirit will move again and bring revival to that nation.